Welcome, Mikael, to the Human Endurance Podcast. Super excited to have you on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to talk from one podcaster to another and also being in the same space of triathlon. So, super excited for this conversation. And I want to open up this question about getting to know you as a person a bit better. If you can introduce yourself, who is the man behind Scientific Triathlon and That Triathlon Show?
Well, I think my background is as an engineer, not as an athlete or a sports scientist or anything like that. But I came into endurance sports when I was 17 when I did my first marathon, and I did it basically because a friend of mine had done it the year before when he was 16. And even though technically you weren't allowed to do that marathon at least until you were 18, he just put down 18 as his age. So then the next year I decided to do the same thing and join him. And my first marathon was a 3 hour 56 marathon. I was very active as a kid, but I was playing football or soccer. So I was not into endurance sports. And I honestly can't remember at all how that marathon, pacing wise, if it was a pretty fast first half and then I faded. I definitely got very tired at the end and I probably cramped quite a bit, but I didn't show any talent as an endurance athlete, let's put it that way. But yeah, I gradually, especially as I started university, I stopped playing football and just was running just to keep fit and yeah, in between doing everything I could to not be fit with the university lifestyle. Other than that, and I got gradually more and more into running and started enjoying it, getting gradually fitter. Again, nothing very impressive, but over the course of a few years, yeah, the I got more serious. I got faster, not that fast, but I got into it. I got really into it. Started learning more and more. Started getting better and better. And then I got injured, and I got into triathlon because I couldn't run, but I could swim and bike. And I had always had in the back of my mind to do a triathlon. I actually did my first triathlon also, I think, when I was 17 that same year. But just as a not even a race, it was a club event, you could say, without any racing. I did it in a surfing wetsuit and on an old um, city bike, basically. And then I do remember cramping heavily on the run because it wasn't even my own bike, I think. So probably the bike fit wasn't the best. Plus, it wasn't a bike meant for that sort of riding 40 kilometers. It was an Olympic distance. Anyway, when I was getting into running, I had in the back of my mind that okay, I'm gonna do my fastest possible runs, and then I'm gonna try some triathlons after that. But it started way earlier than that, and I got really into triathlon. Started learning more and more about it. I was already doing a bit of run coaching at that time, and then as I got more into triathlon, got some experience myself, I also started coaching triathlon, and now I've been doing that for coming up on yeah, it will be 9 years full time as a triathlon coach later this year in September, October or so. So been doing it for a while now.
Quite some time. That's really cool. And what was it about coaching that fascinated you? And then also, how come then you started scientific triathlon? Because I guess you saw a lack of something, and you wanted to create a group around um, scientific based training.
Yeah, it was Scientific Triathlon was a name that came up um, more on a whim than anything. I was definitely really into the sports science. So, but it was the first thing that came to mind, and I didn't think too much about it. Maybe if I had, if I would redo it today, maybe I would call it something different because I don't identify, you know, single-mindedly with a science-based approach because I think that can also be limiting. I think I take the approach of using the science as much as I can, along with using experience, my experience, other coaches' experience, and using the athlete's experience. And but I guess the scientific mindset is really, and that was my engineering background, really like experimentation, figuring things out, and applying almost a scientific method, but not in a scalable way where you have a sample of in sports science pretty small samples, but let's say 20 people, but you take each person as their own sample, but you're still being systematic. So I had that way of being process oriented, being systematic, being analytical from my engineering background. So I think that also played into the whole the name and the approach to, and my interest for coaching, because in endurance sports there is such there is such a value in that kind of approach to coaching, because it's quite, you can be relatively, I wouldn't say numbers oriented, but systematic. I think if you're being systematic, you can do a lot right, because a lot of the basic principles of endurance training can be done very, very well just by being systematic.
Yeah, super interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about how you select coaches for Scientific Triathlon? Do you also look for coaches that have a similar mentality to yours, really looking to be, evidence-based and experimentation? What's that process like?
To be honest, that particular attribute can be important, but it's a bit farther down the list, because I also think it's valuable when you're building a team to not have everybody have the same experience, the same opinions, and the same background. I think that probably weakens the strength of the team as a whole. So the main thing, the number one thing that I think a good coach should have is they should be passionate about it. They should, because you can't be a good coach if you're not, because it's not the career that's going to make you super rich or anything like that. It's to do a good job, you just need to be passionate about it, and you need to be willing to learn and upskill, because otherwise you get left behind quite easily. And that's, I guess, no different than many other careers as well. But I think maybe it's more important in coaching than in many careers, because it can happen so quickly, because it's not a stable employment in a way. Your athletes might leave you after 1 month if you're not doing a good job. So you have to constantly be doing a good job, and otherwise you lose your athletes. So I think that willingness to learn, willingness to be open-minded about things, not have a fixed way of seeing things, that's something that I also find super important for myself, to be open-minded. And when, for example, I would when talking about things like coaching philosophy, for me it's not about this is the amount of volume we need to do, or this is the amount of intensity we need to do, this is the type of intensity we're doing polarized, or we're doing threshold. It's all of those things have their place, but I don't want to identify with one training method. And I think for coaches that I look to add to the team, that is maybe one thing that I like to see the same, that they're open-minded to different ways of working and to updating their priors at any time that they get new information.
Continuously learning. You clearly did a good job, because we interviewed Toby, who's also part of Scientific Triathlon. And when we asked him about his coaching philosophy, he said, my philosophy is to have no philosophy, and basically shared the same thing that you shared. So something is working out. I'm curious to hear, though, okay, whilst you don't have a philosophy per se, but would you say there are fundamentals that you go by in endurance training, fundamentals that you always apply with different athletes and within the coaching group as well?
Yeah, for sure. For me personally, I don't necessarily control how the other coaches coach, or I don't do that. So, but we of course talk about coaching. So I know that many of the very basics we do share the same philosophies. But speaking only for myself, the fundamentals of the sports, the events that we coach, which is mainly triathlon, but we also coach other endurance sports, but distances from, let's say, 5K running upwards, sprint distance triathlon upwards, those sorts of events, even, let's say, e-racing on the bike, where you go for maybe 20 minutes and upwards. They're all fundamentally aerobic sports, so you need to put in a big aerobic workload to adapt the aerobic system, and all the components of that system. They adapt over time to chronic workload. So that's something you can't really cut. You can't find the magic bullet, the silver bullet in terms of different workouts or different training intensity distributions that are going to make you magically faster. You need to put in the work. Putting in aerobic work doesn't mean just, people hear that sometimes they think, oh, you just mean like big volume, low intensity. No, I don't mean that. You also have to work hard. Intensity is a much stronger stimulus than low intensity. So basically, you can boil it down, my philosophy really, to there are different types of intense sessions, right? And depending on the athlete profile, this is an important part of my philosophy, to figure out what kind of athlete I have in front of me. What is their profile? Are they more slow twitch dominant, fast twitch dominant, or more of a hybrid in between? And depending on that, and depending on what events they're training for, that will to some extent dictate what are the types of more intense sessions that they will be more suited to do. So you plan those intense sessions, you have a reasonable progression based on their level, but around that, and more important than the intense sessions themselves, within the constraints of their life and their availability to train, you just want to maximize the aerobic volume that they can do over time. And that means also being consistent, fundamentally staying healthy, staying injury free, and not burning out mentally either. So that you can do that over not just 1 year, but 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, because it really, even if you start when you're a bit older, let's say you start when you're 45, you can definitely improve for at least 10 years. You can still be improving when you're 55, maybe even 15 years. That depends a little bit more on different factors, but it takes a decade rather than a year to maximize your potential in an aerobic sport, and that's even if it's a sprint distance or a 5K run that you're training for.
Yeah, I think that's also the nice thing about triathlon or endurance sport in general, that it's this slow progression, right? If you would get your biggest gains within a year, it would be a bit boring, because then you know what else is there out there. So I think that's really nice. But I also do see lots of people aiming to, do a sub 9 hour Ironman in their second one, or those crazy goal, which I think it's sometimes can lead to burnout and injury. But where I actually was gonna go was, you mentioned that the most important part for you is figuring out what kind of athlete you have in front of you, kind of athlete archetype, and how do you find that out? What processes, what tests do you do for that?
Well, pretty important first step is just asking the athlete, talking with the athlete, and even in the onboarding questionnaire that we use when taking in new athletes, we ask for things like sporting history and so on. So, for example, if somebody says that they used to be an ice hockey player, then that's a very explosive sport where you basically play in 1 minute, super intense efforts, and then you rest, and then you do it again and again and again. Or various other team sports are similar. Basketball, even football or soccer has a bit of a mix of, depending on the player type you are, you could fall on one or the other side of the spectrum. So, and of course, you can have some people coming in from non-team sports, combat sports, or even coming in from a middle distance running background or a track cycling background, those sorts of sports. So that doesn't necessarily tell you that just because you did a sport doesn't mean that that's your profile. But athletes do tend to gravitate towards what they're good at. So it at least gives you a first indication, and then you need to verify whether that's true or not. And how you do that is, you can have a discussion with the athlete. If it's somebody that has been doing some running, asking about their performance in races like 5K, 10K, half marathon, compare those times. Where are they relatively stronger? Do they run basically the same pace for a half marathon as they do a 10K, or is there a very big drop off? And the same thing from the 10K to the 5K. You can profile based on race results like that. Also, what type of training do they enjoy doing? Do they enjoy going out for 2.5 hour long runs with some marathon intensity, or do they enjoy doing 400s on the track? that can tell you a lot. And then finally, you can of course do a bunch of different tests. So critical power testing, critical speed testing is a very simple and very effective way to do that. And for example, critical power testing on the bike, you could do a 3-minute all-out effort. Then on a different day, you do a 5 or 6-minute all-out effort. And then on a third day, you do an all-out 12-minute effort or even a 20-minute effort. The durations don't matter so much, but you can use those 3 ideally different durations with different all-out power numbers that you get to establish how strong you are aerobically versus anaerobically by calculating your critical power and W prime. And there are a bunch of calculators to help you do that. We have one on the Scientific Triathlon website, and yeah, that's really good for cycling and for swimming. For running, I'm a bit cautious of doing that, and I tend to just look at 5K and 10K race times that a lot of people have anyway. And even just what I said before about how they perform and how they enjoy different types of training. That's not to say that you can't do it in running. Of course, you can do it. I think it's just a bit more. It's not, and I'm not even so concerned about the physical, the physical load of it, but more so the mental load of going really deep in running is a bit harder than in the other sports for most people. Yeah, usually even shorter. On for running, I would tend to do, because I do that sometimes for some athletes, and I would do something like a 3-minute and a 6-minute and a 10-minute all-out test probably. And or if we do distance based on the track, what I've done is, for example, 1 kilometer, 1600 meters, 1 mile basically, and 3 kilometer all-out test. So it doesn't even have to go as far as 5 kilometers.
Mm-hmm. And Mikael, what happens then afterwards when you figure out, okay, this is likely the archetype of this athlete? Okay, maybe this person has a really strong aerobic base, but in shorter distances, they really are not that fast. What do you do then? Do you work mostly on the areas where the athlete is weak, or do you try to strengthen the ones that they're good at? Can you tell us a little bit about how to think about where to put the efforts there?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite questions to ask other coaches about, including on my own podcast, because I find it quite a difficult question, and I don't know if I have the right answer. But my current thinking, and I reserve the right to change my mind, is that you basically want to make sure that your weaknesses are not limiters for you, but you are unlikely to make a weakness a strength. So you're also well served by continuing to work on your strengths quite a lot, and you are potentially have more upside putting a lot of effort into what's already strong for you and making that a superpower almost. So that's a bit how I think about it. But yeah, you can use your periodization to work on both. That's what you should be doing. But I think it's maybe a mistake, and definitely a mistake that I've done. Or if it is a mistake, I've done that mistake to maybe focus too much on weaknesses at times. And sometimes if you just hammer and hammer and hammer on those weaknesses, whether it's that you don't have enough endurance or that you're not strong enough in those short and sharp efforts, it's just you're just going to pretty quickly plateau, or the athlete's going to pretty quickly plateau. So yeah, I find spreading out those efforts, touching on that stimulus quite a lot, but not going overboard with it, and doing that continuously over time to make sure that that weakness isn't a limiter while you're building and building on your strength. That's maybe the best solution that I, at least at the moment, see for after that profiling. But then, so that's the big picture perspective, is that's how I use that profiling. But then there are also other things within that profiling helps me do, which is, for example, how do you prescribe, how do you execute different types of sessions. That I think varies depending on if you're, at least if you're on either extreme, you're very slow twitch versus you're very fast twitch dominant. For example, somebody who's very fast twitch dominant I would almost never prescribe something like zone 2 training. It would always be, all endurance training would be much lower or significantly lower intensity like that at the zone 1, because doing zone 2 is not easy. Zone 2 is more like approaching moderate intensity. And when you do it for long enough, it becomes outright hard. So, and for a fast twitch athlete, that's a pretty easy way to burn out and overtrain. So the endurance training I would tend to prescribe as a significantly lower percentage of threshold, or however you want to prescribe it, for the fast twitch athlete than the slow twitch athlete. Somebody who's very slow twitch can probably go out and train zone 2 every day, but somebody who's more fast twitch oriented, no, never. And the same is almost true for intensity as well. A slow twitch dominant athlete can do quite a lot of intensity because they're not capable of stretching their muscular capacity as far as the fast twitch athlete, or their metabolic capacity. So it's much harder to overtrain a slow twitch dominant athlete, and it's very easy to overtrain a fast twitch dominant athlete. But fast twitch dominant, and it makes it sound like, oh, you want to be a slow twitch dominant athlete. I don't think that's the case. I think about fast twitch dominant athletes coming into endurance sports as basically like full breeds but they require, or almost like a Ferrari. But just because you have a Ferrari doesn't mean that you will always win races. If something is wrong in your maintenance of that Ferrari, then it's not even going to start on the line, right? Compared to your Fiat Punto that is going to always start. So you need to be much more careful, I would say, and deliberate with how you approach training with those fast dominance athletes, especially when it comes to fatigue management, load management, and avoiding overtraining.
Yeah, super interesting. And there's so many factors playing into especially triathlon training. And I'm also curious. Now you were talking about sport specific, but how about across the different disciplines, right? Let's say you have an athlete that's quite weak on the run, but very strong on the bike and average on the swim. How do you then build? Do you build on the strength of the specific discipline or the weakness? And how do you think about that? I guess it also depends a bit on the distance, right? Because bike necessarily is the longest, or essentially is the longest part of the race. But I'm curious to hear your thought process on how you approach that across the disciplines.
It's similar to what I already said about strengths and weaknesses, with the physiological profile, that you need to make sure that the weakness is not a limiter to achieve your goal, so it needs to be good enough. But I do think that the same thing applies, that if you're naturally talented as a runner and you're not naturally talented as a cyclist, I would try to make the run more of a superpower and make sure that the run is good enough that is still allowing you to put you in a position to then use the run to achieve your goals. And obviously this is if somebody has been doing triathlon, they've been doing all three sports, swimming, biking, and running for some time. Because if it's somebody who has been running their whole life and then they come into triathlon, of course their bike is going to be weak at first, but they might have actually a bigger talent for cycling than for running. So then you just need to give it a bit of time to see until see how it plays out with the bike training that you're doing, because they might actually have the potential to have their bike be a superpower, even if they're already a decent runner.
And how do you see if somebody has talent for, let's say, biking? How do you see that? Somebody coming in, like maybe you can share a story as well.
It's adapting quickly to training load. It's improving their performance really rapidly. I need to think about. I have the first example that comes to mind is not an example of somebody that has a lot of talent, but actually the opposite. Somebody who was a very talented runner, but it was clear from pretty early on that the bike was never going to be a strength. So we needed to just make sure that it was good enough, but not a limiter. So this person had a very good marathon PB, Olympic trials qualifier in the United States. But the bike, even after putting in like good volume, because he had the possibility to train quite a lot, trying different sorts of intensity. We didn't see like we saw improvement all the time, but at his age, still pretty young, at his like talent level as a runner, the response wasn't that kind of fast upward curve that you would see if he was somebody that was very talented as a cyclist. So then the focus in that situation is still going to be that, yeah, continue to work on the bike, of course, but yeah, don't make sure that you don't make the run slower. Like keep the run a big focus so that the run is as fast or gets even faster, because sometimes the run can get even faster when you add in cycling and swimming as well, even if you run less. So that's an example of, I think it's just about how quickly is the rate of development, and that will depend on how much they're training and as well. So somebody who is, and even the age of the athlete and some other factors. But yeah, if you have somebody in their 20s and they're pretty athletic in general, they have a lot of time to train, so you can put a decent amount of training in their schedule. And then in some cases you see really rapid development in whatever discipline you're focusing on. And then that's a sign that, okay, this person has talent there.
It's very interesting. And Mikael, usually here on the podcast, we talk more about beginners and helping them to get started or how to actually improve in the first few years in the sport. But with you, we want to take a different approach and ask you more towards how to make those incremental gains when you are already a decent athlete. So here comes a difficult question, but I'm curious to hear how you would break it down. So imagine somebody comes to you and they've been, doing triathlon for already like 3-4 years. They're a decent amateur. They've maybe qualified for a world championship already, and they're looking to make those incremental gains and be faster and maybe place better in their age group. How do you figure out with this athlete what is the best course of action? What are the levers that you look to change in their training or lifestyle or anything that you think are usually the most important to look at?
Were you describing me? Just kidding.
I would. This is going back to that sort of engineering systematic approach. Look at what is the goal of the athlete, what is their current performance level, what are the gaps, do a gap analysis, and then you see, okay, first of all, is this goal realistic, and then you need to assess, well, how, if we assume that it can be achieved, how can it be achieved? Is the volume that they're doing enough to see those improvements that they want to see? Is their lifestyle conducive to that, like I said? So this is where you need to, okay, the data helps with the training aspect. You can look at how much are they training, what type of training are they doing. To assess the lifestyle, I'm not super big on wearables and things like that. I prefer to have a conversation with the athlete, ask them about their sleep habits, their sleep quality, their nutrition habits, recovery habits, stress level. I mean, I think general stress is also underestimated, because you can have some really high performing individuals, not just in sport, but in life, that are seemingly doing all the right things, getting maybe not 10 hours of sleep, but let's say 8 hours of sleep. So something that you would see as decent, as acceptable. Great nutrition, like really focusing on it, knowing what they're doing. But they're just so stressed that there is no possibility that they will ever adapt to any training, at least not at the level of training that they need to be doing to continue to improve. In some cases, you can actually argue that you need to reduce the training. And if they can convert that reduction of training volume to a reduction of stress, then they can improve. So total stress, I think, is really important. I know that, there's an argument to be made for that you should be measuring that with things like HRV and so on. I've used that. I have not seen that as being a successful way of measuring what's going on and being able to take an informed action on that. So that's my current take on that, which maybe goes a bit against the grain today. But it's so you have to put those parts together: the goal, the current level, You need to look at the training they're doing. You need to look at the lifestyle, and then see, okay, what are the biggest levers, the non-negotiables almost that you first need to pull. Often that's either related to training volume or related to lifestyle factors. It's pretty rare that you can just say that, oh, we need to do this different intensity sessions, and that's going to help you improve. So it could be related to a bit of a poor distribution of effort in terms of their and even of time allocation in the training. Some people might spend way too much time with, for example, swimming if their goal is a sub 9-hour Ironman, where so much of that is going to come from a strong bike and a strong run. And if you reallocate some time, then that could be enough to help the athlete achieve that. Or even strength training, I see that as well. Sometimes allocating too much time to strength training. I am a proponent of strength training, but if you're going to optimize your triathlon performance, then I see strength training as something that you do at a minimal effective dose, and yeah, you need to basically look at it from that ROI perspective, return on investment of your effort and your time, because otherwise you're not going to be able to maybe fit in the work that you really need to do to, let's say, improve your bike or improve your run. Then it's a different question if your goal is to perform at a professional level, because then the swim needs to come to a certain level where you can swim with the front group really to be competitive. And even if that comes in the early stages at the expense of maybe something else, your run, because you don't have as much time to allocate to the run, or you're just a bit tired from all the swimming, then that's fine for now. Like, get to the stay in the race for as long as possible in that situation. And then as long as you're staying in the race, always work on the next point where you're dropping off from the race. When you're staying in the race on the swim, then okay, great. Let's now work on the bike. If you're getting dropped on the bike, great. You're now stay in the race on the bike. Then we're working on the run. Not to say that that's exclusively. You're always working on a lot of all of those things, but where the main focus really is, if those goals are more performance oriented in terms of race dynamics related goals.
So again, I'm just hearing on how complex everything is, right? There's just limited time, especially in triathlon. You do have 3 disciplines, and even 4 if you count strength training, and putting that all together, plus the 8 hours of sleep or 10 hours, like you said, and doing everything perfectly right. It's really a trade-off that you always work with training, recovery, and finding this ultimate secret sauce is the coach's job, and that's the hard thing, I think, to do.
Yeah, it is complex because there are a lot of moving parts, but it's not complicated. It really isn't. It's work, and it's recovery, and it's adaptation. And I think that's often in this example with the how do you improve an athlete who's already quite good. Sometimes they probably started out doing things pretty simply, maybe not correctly, but pretty simply. Then over time, things get more and more complicated. And as a coach, quite often the way that you help an athlete is, well, you need to simplify things. Maybe you need to remove some of the things that they're doing so that they don't have to be as stressed all the time, or so that they have time to go to bed an hour earlier, or so that they can, maybe they're doing too many intense sessions. They just need to do more endurance work, things like that. But I think it's I don't want to make it sound like things are complicated and that you need to be this mad scientist type of thing who is turning all these knobs and levers and you have these formulas on the bookshelf, and because that's not what it is. It's really like, it's quite simple, but finding the right balance and the right trade-offs, that's it's a bit of an art as well as there's definitely an art as well as a science. So experience absolutely comes into it. And I think like being objective about things, that's one of the things that go wrong for athletes, that they might be perfectly able to tell their friend what they're doing wrong in their training, but they can't see what they're doing wrong in their own training, right? And I think I definitely have that issue in my own athletic pursuits, I guess. And that's something, that's why being coached, even when you're a coach and you know all these things, it's really such a valuable thing. So yeah, basically because I think that that's something that maybe sometimes comes across as coaches want to gatekeep knowledge. That's really not the I think that that's an incorrect picture, at least from my perspective. That shouldn't be the picture that a listener gets from this, or a viewer gets from this episode. It's not complicated, even though it's complex because you have a lot of moving parts. But it's pretty simple when you boil it down to the overarching things.
I like this quote. It's not complicated. Sorry, it's not
It's not. Yeah, it's not complicated. It's complex, but it's not complicated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I like it because I mean it's also when you ask every pro who's performing at the top level what is their secret, nobody has a secret. So they all just say, hey, I do my sessions, I don't do anything too different. But I guess putting everything into one piece, that's the thing, that's the secret sauce, but not the single session that is magical.
Yeah, and I think one thing that leads to their success, I mean, the secret is also hard work. Like sometimes we shy away from hard work because we get bombarded with messages about, you know, measuring your recovery status and the optimal nutrition for recovery, and this is how you optimize your sleeping environment. All of that. Rest is super important. You can't adapt without, like, stress plus rest equals growth. That's the fundamental equation of improvement. But when you're still far from your potential, like, you can do a lot of things wrong with this. This is going to be, this is a bit irresponsible of me to say maybe, but you can do a lot of things wrong on the rest side and still improve if you're putting in the work. You cannot, fully optimize your recovery and become a good athlete if you're not putting in the work. You can become a pretty good athlete with very bad recovery, very bad on all of those things if you're putting in the work, and you have a bit of luck that you don't get injured, you're relatively resilient, which, it's not at all unheard of. Especially if you hear about, like, the old school athletes and everything they did, all of the really stupid things they did really, but still got very, very fast. I think that that's a good reminder that to not shy away from the hard work, and the hard work, not just meaning intensity, obviously, but it's just a lot of work, total workload.
Yeah, discipline always wins.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to jump on a point you made about the usefulness of a coach having a coach. So I was, throughout my whole life, self-coached. After I left university, I ran cross-country and track at university in the US. So I was coached then. Then afterwards, I always coached myself. I thought, why should I hire anybody? Because, well, I know the science and I know my body better than anyone. I managed to get through 8 marathons, but then I stumbled across so many injuries the last 2 years. And I decided this year to work with a coach, Marco Altini, the HRV god.
Last year.
Yeah, true. Last year, we're in 2026. And honestly, it's been a super amazing experience for me. Indeed, having this person with an outside perspective that can make you see things in different ways and bring different kinds of training has been extremely healthy and useful for me. So it's it's something cool for the listeners to know. Even if you have some knowledge, I think working with somebody that can just bring more of this outside view and more knowledge, obviously, because different people come with different backgrounds and experiences. It can be quite useful.
And I think especially when the sooner you start working with a coach over time, like usually very few people work with a coach for 15 years, 10, 15 years. It's usually a few years if it's a good coaching relationship, and then maybe even the coach says that then maybe it would be good for you to work with somebody else in some cases, if the athlete has stopped improving. But even if you work with one coach like that, if you continue to work with one coach for many years, which I have some athletes that I worked with for basically since I went full time or very close to that anyway, so like coming up on 9 years soon. That's the longest, and I have several that I've worked with for 7, 8 years, so quite a long time. But my coaching has changed over this time, so I'm not a different coach, but they're still getting very new input. It's not the same thing over and over again. But whether that's the case for you, you have one coach and you get new inputs from that same coach, or you maybe work with one coach for a few years, then the next coach for a few other years, and then a third coach for a few more years. Suddenly you have all of these inputs that you've learned from different coaches, and that you can, when you're going to be in such a better place to then self-coach when you have all of that learning from different people or from one person or a long time, and you can put those pieces together with things that maybe you think yourself in your own belief system or your own experience as an athlete and or even as a coach, and but doing it earlier on rather than later, then you can benefit from it later on, compared to doing it the other way around, being self-coached, having all of these issues, and then finally getting help later on, and then everything is solved. But it's like, yeah, it's basically the investment analogy of of compound interest with investing money, right? That you, if you do it earlier, you're going to be much better off later on than rather than if you do it later.
Yeah, true. For me also, I also work with a coach, and for me, the thing that's really striking is how my coach knows better what I can perform, on a given day. Like I sometimes look at my sessions and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I can hit those paces, especially when I'm already quite progressed in my training cycle. I like fatigue is accumulating, but then I'm surprised that mostly it works, and I can just make it. So I'm always surprised, because that's not something I would put myself, because I would be like, oh, maybe this is, it's then that's where the personal subjective perception comes in, and you get biased, whereas you have this outside person that just is looking from the outside and knows, hey, the athlete can do that. So that's for me such a great benefit.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and but there are people that are the other way as well that need to be held back more. So, yeah, yeah, it's also me. At least when it comes to the things like the volume of training, and maybe not right now in my life, but in the past, I would say that I would just want to do more and more, even if it wasn't better. Um, so yeah, I think that's something that a coach, that's another part of athlete profiling. It's a different kind of profiling, right? But understanding whether the athlete tends to underestimate what they can do and what they should do, or overestimate it, and trying to bring it back a bit to the middle.
Yeah.
Completely.
Cool. Let's talk data.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk data. One of our favorite topics. Both Fabi and I are in the data world in our professional careers. And we are curious to hear from you. What are some, let's say, 2 to 3 metrics that you constantly look at to try and quantify athlete performance and how well they are adapting to training? Do you have some favorites to share?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I think every single session, I want to have an external load metric. So that would be pace if you're running or swimming, or power if you're cycling, and an internal load metric, which would be heart rate normally. Lactate could come in there in some sessions as well, but heart rate would be the main one. And then RPE, which is a bit of a combination of a bunch of different factors, even things like not just external internal load, but also psychological factors and environmental factors, and things like that. Stress would come into that, fatigue. So if you have those three, then you can really then you can over time measure whether or not an athlete is adapting to training, or if they're being overtrained or what have you. Because if your external to internal ratio is increasing, right? So your pace is getting faster for the same heart rate. That could mean either that you're getting fitter, or it could mean that you're getting into a state of at least overreaching, maybe functional overreaching or non-functional, or even overtraining if it goes on for more of a chronic period. And the way to determine which one it is with RPE. So if you're running faster for the same heart rate and your RPE is going down, so it's feeling easier, then you're adapting to the training. But if the opposite is true, you're running, in that case, it would usually be that you're running the same speed, but heart rate is going down, so lower heart rate, but RPE is going up, so it's getting harder to do that same pace. Then that's a sign of, in the beginning, could be functional overreaching. You're just in a period of heavy training load, then you deload and you adapt and you get a positive response. But give it a couple of weeks and it's suddenly non-functional overreaching, and give it a month or two and you could be in overtraining. So depends on whether it's swimming, cycling, or running. But really, for any coach, I think that if you become really, really good at mastering those metrics, that's like 95 or 99% of the work done. Of course, that in terms of the data, that is, because there are other things with the communication side of things that are just as important. But in terms of the data, there are other data streams that can be really interesting and that definitely matter. But for the most part, those data streams are by far the most important.
And in the end, I mean, RPE is some sort of communication, right? Because you only get this metric through the athletes themselves and not through any device.
Yeah, true.
Which also, again, leads me to something you mentioned before, right? You said for you, it's super important to be in constant communication with your athletes, to know how they feel. And how do you communicate with your athlete? Like, what's some pointers or data points you look for to understand if your athlete is doing well, if they're, how they manage the load, especially when we go towards peak peak volume phase when you're preparing somebody for a race?
So I mean, it's I ask my athletes to always comment on their workouts. So a lot of communication happens basically through the comments, and how to know if they're doing well. In addition to what I already said with the RPE and the external internal measures of load, I ask the athletes to how do you write a good workout comment? Well, one of the main things that needs to be there is some kind of description of how you need to understand how hard the workout was, and that's the RPE. But you also need to understand how the athlete felt about their performance, because an athlete or a workout can be really hard, but you're also performing very well, maybe even above your expectation. You have a bit of a breakthrough workout. So that needs to be communicated somehow. So now Training Peaks, for example, have the smiley faces to illustrate that, which is a good tool. I think the best way is if you also, in addition to something like that, you get that in more written form, so that the athlete can elaborate a bit on, how put in their own words how they felt that the workout was in terms of how hard it was and how they performed in the workout. And this way you can really get a good feel for where the athlete is, because if you know that how hard a certain workout was, you know how hard you expected it to be, you know how the athlete performed compared to their expectation of how they thought that they would perform, then you can pretty easily see if there's something else going on that you need to investigate. Like if things are going in the wrong direction, you need to investigate things like stress, lifestyle factors. If you assuming that you know that the training is pretty much, there's no problem with the training itself. Of course, you need to look into that as well if you made some error in terms of the load management of the athlete there. But yeah, I think that those are the main things. There are some other things as well. Like I think when we're talking about training, especially for longer races, asking an athlete to comment on nutrition and hydration, that's really important. And understanding that A, they are actually practicing what they'll do on race day, but B, also when you're doing long sessions with some race intensity, that you just can't do that well without like decent nutrition hydration, and you definitely can't do that well and then expect to train well the next day again. So that's one of the main things as well that I would like to see in terms of the athlete communicating, which is more of a, that's not a, it's a data point in a way, but you need to get that directly from the athlete, because there are no wearables at this time that automatically measures every gram of carbohydrate that comes into the body. That would actually be great. I would definitely encourage everybody to use that wearable.
Yeah, but it is interesting because it's even like things such as trying a new gel, right? If you don't really track that, you don't know, because there's again so many factors. And I have an example of I I tried Morton gels for quite some time, and it took me a while to realize that it was the gel that I couldn't digest well, or something was off with some ingredient there, and I always had issues on my runs when I took this Morton gel. But I was also mixing some other gels on other days, so it was really hard for me to pinpoint what happened on those specific sessions that led me to have to stop my run and go to the toilet, and it ended up being the gel. So that can also have a big impact, even though the training, there was nothing wrong with the training and anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, even things like equipment as well. What shoes did you run in? Well, that's another important thing, I guess, in terms of the what I want an athlete to comment on. Of course, if they have any niggles or things like that, then that should definitely be something that they communicate. But related to that, it could be things like the shoes that they're running in. Are they getting too worn out? They've been using them for a long time. On the bike, whether they used a TT bike and rode in TT position, or on the road bike, or a TT bike but sitting up. So those sort of things are also quite important things. It doesn't mean that every comment needs to have all of those things necessarily, because once you get to know an athlete and their habits, then things become easier and easier, and you kind of know all of those things automatically, because they're just habits more so than anything. But they're all things that at least need to be considered at some point. So if I as a coach don't know these things and the athlete isn't commenting, then it's something that I need to ask them and reach out and say, hey, are you actually riding your TT bike because you have your race coming up soon?
Yeah, it's also like doing a workout in a TT bike, but not in a TT position. Feels like sometimes I feel like I'm cheating. I'm like, okay, let me do this interval. I'm not in a position. It's gonna be easier. It's like different kind of effort in the end.
Yeah, but it's quite cool to hear you talking about the importance of collecting this information. We see on our side, so Fabi and I, both as coaches and athletes, that like today with the tools out there, you're not really encouraged to do this in a structured way. So right, with Training Peaks, it's like an open box, and I myself as an athlete, sometimes I don't know what to put there, and I kind of forget, and I think through that. Sometimes I miss sharing on key things. So that's something we're trying to do with Algo, which you're also using with one or two athletes, and actually encouraging athletes to share session feedback right away, so they can track key things like pains and nutrition, which honestly has been super helpful already. The app has only been around since December, so it's really early days, but I've already caught, like, I have one athlete that has so many niggles that I had an experience with him last year where he just wouldn't tell me that he had a problem until it was too late. And then I was like, come on, how should you need to tell me earlier on, because he would always tell me when he was just could not walk anymore. And so I'm coaching him again. And he's already putting there, okay, I have some minor discomforts, and it's so useful because I can already be like, okay, then we're going to reduce the load, we're going to do something else. And these things are just so simple, but so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then that's one example. Definitely have experienced that type of athlete as well, and also the type of athlete that never eats during training. So if you get an automatic prompt that you actually need to put in your amount of carbohydrates consumed, in the comments, then or in the session feedback, then that's at least hopefully going to be a trigger for them to to consume something.
Yeah, I've uncovered some of those already too.
Yeah, I think under fueling is a big thing generally. I think also myself, just it's a like I can just survive this ride with just some water, just or being in a hurry and just kind of forgetting about it. But then it's compounding with recovery that's less, and you're just going down the rabbit hole to some degree. So I think that's such a big factor also for training. And then I'm also curious actually to hear, speaking about nutrition, what your view is on nutrition, and are you also on the high carb team, or again are you having different opinion on how much carbs an athlete should take?
Well, I think this easily gets taken to one extreme or the other. I think if you're one of the best athletes in the world, you're trying to become the Ironman world champion, then yeah, I believe you need to be high carb to achieve that today. If you're an athlete trying to go sub 10 hours for an Ironman, I think you most likely don't need to take on 150 grams of carbs per hour, but you also shouldn't try to do it on 30 grams of carbs per hour. So I think that the sports nutrition recommendations that we've had for quite some time, they are still very good for the typical athlete. And they would tend to say that, it's a typical 60 to 90 grams an hour, but in our case with triathlon at least, and especially when you're talking about the longer triathlons, you kind of need to be at that upper end because you're going to run your glycogen stores too low. So basically, I would say that 90 grams per hour is a very perfect number to shoot for most athletes in most racing scenarios and in most training scenarios that are either longer sessions or more intense sessions, because not only will that help you to not get depleted in that session, but also recover faster, recover better, absorb the training load better, be able to train better the next day. But it's also at the same time that's helping you practice for what you'll do on race day. So you can make things pretty simple and say that I'm on team 90 grams an hour for in the most cases. That being said, I mean, personally as an athlete, I would take on slightly more or at least, yeah, on the bike for sure more, but even as an average for the triathlon, I would be slightly higher than that when doing half and full distance races. But I never managed to be much higher than that. And maybe that is because at my intensity, which is a pretty high intensity, but definitely not a world-class intensity, maybe I just wasn't able to use as much as I was putting in if I was doing higher amounts. So I tended to be maybe 120 to 130 grams on the bike, but as an average for the race, 100 to 105 grams an hour, and that seemed to be the limit and what worked well.
I'm glad to hear about the 90. That's what my nutritionist has recommended me.
Yeah.
And wait, I had a question. Yeah, and it's okay, reassuring to hear that you're kind of following the same train of thought as most people. What are your thoughts on coaches and scientists that really hammer on, building your fat burning capabilities and kind of vouch for trying to do lower carb intake so that you have this, bigger engine to go on for very long races like a full Ironman?
I mean, I don't think there are so many people doing that anymore, are there? There are some people doing it, but not that many. Or am I wrong?
I'm not sure what the distribution is.
I mean, I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that's you're trying to defy the laws of physics. You have an engine that's burning and it's burning for a long time. You need energy to produce the power that produces the forward propulsion to get to the finish line. So it's it's pretty simple math really in terms of how much energy you burn per hour in a race, even at a relatively low intensity. And we know that most of that is, no matter how good your fat burning is, you're still going to burn a lot of carbs even at a low intensity. So yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me. And but I don't see a lot of serious discussion about that. The one thing that has been more recently, I guess, in vogue is the fasted training, whether to use fast even if you're on more of a traditional either high carb or like medium, like 90 grams an hour, which I guess most people would still be on. Should you use maybe once or twice a week, do a fasted session to still within the realms of using carbs, improve your fat oxidation, and I think that there was some mechanistic science some about 10 years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, that showed some promise there, but I think that the research hasn't really borne out that it works in practice, and the science has definitely not borne it out. Or sorry, the practice has not borne it out. So yeah, I used to do that. I used to prescribe that as a coach, and I used to do that as an athlete. Uh, I had some success during that period as an athlete. I think I would have had more success if I had not done it, but it's hard to say. Maybe I'm wrong there. Definitely as a coach, I never saw that translate into improved performance, even though I also didn't have any catastrophic mishaps. So, but it's something I moved away from as a coach. I think largely most coaches have, but that's still a more of a nuanced, interesting tool in the toolbox that has been used within still a reasonable approach to race nutrition and overall nutrition.
Yeah, and then fasted, right, for females, that's also another topic versus males. There's also some research that for females, or males can rather do fasted. Females, it's a big no-go. That's some things, some research I read. And then overall, every person is different, right? How people can handle different trainings, fasted or not fasted. But I would like to change a bit the direction from nutrition to training zones. I'm curious to hear how you work with if you work with a zone system, and how do you reassess zones for your athletes? Is this a concept you use? And if yes, do you work with 5 zones, 3 zones, or do you do something in the middle? Curious.
I use 5 zones in terms of heart rate, 6 zones in terms of pace or power. So it's still kind of a 5-zone system. The 5 zones are the same, except that at the very high end, there's a 6th zone that is basically above VO2 max. That it's your glycolytic range and your anaerobic range in general. So yeah, the way that I do use zones, even though I do use them. I think for analysis especially, it's really a really useful tool, because you especially over time see how much time you spent in certain zones, and maybe for prescription, I'm a bit more precise than saying that this should be a zone 3 ride or a zone 4 run or a zone 5 swim. Like it's much more narrow. The ranges are narrower than that. But for analysis after the fact, it's very useful. And how I use those zones, or how I come up with them or set them for my athletes, is generally based on a critical power test. So if you take the bike as an example, doing the critical power test, as I explained, calculating the critical power, which again you can do easily with online calculators, and then use a percentage of that for zones 1 to up to threshold. And that's basically the same as the classic Kogan zones, except the fact that Kogan uses zone 4 up to 105% of threshold, and I don't understand why. I stopped my zone 4 at threshold, because above threshold, you're entering the realm where you will reach VO2 max. So that should be part of the VO2 max zone. And so that's the difference there. But the top of zone 5, the way I said it, is that when you do a critical power test, you can also, you get your critical power and you get your W prime, which is your anaerobic work capacity. And you can calculate from that a lot of things. You can calculate, for example, what is the maximum amount of power you could hold for 2 minutes, or so I use basically I use that, but for 3 minutes. If I remember correctly, I need to check my calculator. I use either 2 minutes or 3 minutes it is 3 minutes, I'm pretty sure, as the maximum power for zone 5. So basically, any power that is so high that the athlete couldn't hold it for 3 minutes, even if we haven't done the 3-minute test, but we back calculate it, that goes into zone 6 because of it being anaerobic. Yeah, just a slight caveat that now off the top of my head, I would need to double check if I use 2 minutes or 3 minutes, because it could be either one of them. Doesn't matter too much, to be honest, because it's pretty high intensity that you would pretty rarely use. I would rarely prescribe power quite that high in training anyway. And for heart rate, it's more simple. It's based on max heart rate, and I use the max heart rate that you achieved in that critical power test, so that you can update it fairly regularly. And then up to 70% of max heart rate is your zone 1, 80% is zone 2, 85% is zone 3, 90% is zone 4, and 90 to 100% is zone 5 heart rate. And running wise, it's similar to the bike power, but the percentages are a bit different.
Yeah. Okay. And I heard you talk a lot about critical power and W prime for cycling, and I'm curious to understand if you do FTP 20-minute test, because there's also some people that say, hey, that's an old system, we should move away from it, just use critical power W prime. And I'm curious to hear a bit your pointer or your view on this discussion.
I think classic FTP testing works pretty well, but critical power testing does give you that advantage of it's 2-dimensional, it's not just 1-dimensional, so you can profile the athlete more. But you're not, for the most part, if you do a 20-minute test and you pace it well and it's all out, your threshold, I've had maybe more strong opinions on it before, that it's going to, that in some cases it's going to be overestimated. I kind of softened my stance on that a bit. I think for the most part it's going to be close enough that you can definitely train well with that. I guess it's a bit, the only difficulty there is if for some athletes when they're not good at pacing it correctly, and but that's a problem even if you do critical power testing. You still need to pace those time trials correctly. But the test that I don't like for FTP, setting an FTP, is the ramp test, because that can definitely overestimate quite severely. So yeah, if you want to use FTP, if you want to do a 20-minute test, I think that's perfectly doable. I don't like the ramp test though for that. And actually, in my critical power testing, I tend to have a 20-minute test as one of the time trials. It's a bit unconventional, at least in the scientific literature. They rarely go above, at most, 15 minutes, but usually more like 12 minutes for the longest test. But it's still within the realms of its above threshold, so it works. It will usually set your critical power a bit lower than it would be if you did your longest test slightly shorter. But that way, when I can actually also calculate the classic FTP and critical power, and actually with that protocol, with a 3-minute test and a 5-minute or 6-minute test, I've used both. I'm trying to do 3 minutes and 5 minutes more consistently now, and 20 minutes. They tend to, for most people, be very, very closely matched in most cases.
Mm-hmm. What is your sense for why the ramp test is often overestimating critical power? Does it have to do anything with like it not being a great measure for durability or so? Because the intervals are kind of short in a way, like they're not staying in an effort for too long.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the test itself is too short, because with a ramp test, generally speaking, the ramp tests were designed to assess an athlete's VT1 and VT2 and their VO2 max, right? So usually would have maybe a slower, more of a step test until your VT2, and then you do a ramp test with a pretty fast ramp to your VO2 max. But basically, when you do just that VO2 max part, you want to usually the advice is that you need to reach VO2 max within 12 minutes, or you risk not actually being able to reach your VO2 max because you get too fatigued to reach VO2 max. So the rate of the ramp needs to be quite high, meaning that the test itself is short. It needs to be shorter than 12 minutes, meaning that depending on your anaerobic capacity, that's going to, in a 20-minute test, your anaerobic capacity is going to, as a percentage, going to contribute less to the overall energy contribution. But in a, let's say, a 10-minute ramp test, the contribution of your anaerobic system is going to be bigger. And that's where the error comes in, that athletes with higher anaerobic energy contribution it's going to be overestimate FTP or CP for them. So you would have the same problem if you try to do, actually there is that, I think, double 8-minute test, which I guess the fact that you do 2 of them compensates a bit. But let's say somebody tried to invent a 12-minute FTP test or a 10-minute FTP test, and you just do a different percentage. Instead of 95%, you do 88%. You're going to run into the same issues there, because as the test goes shorter, the anaerobic energy contribution is percentage contribution is growing larger. And in a critical power test, yes, you have much shorter duration still, but because you have multiple of them, you do a linear regression, and that's how you find out the both the aerobic and the anaerobic side. It's just a system of equations really that you're solving for. So yeah, that I think is the reason. But maybe somebody with more of a with more understanding of the physiology would say something different.
I think that was a great explanation. Very very structured.
Good.
So, Mikael, switching gears a little bit, I'm now thinking of an episode that you did on your podcast about, I think it was the 12 most common mistakes triathletes do, something like that. And you had something about specificity being overrated. And I thought that was quite interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean there?
Yeah. So that was, the episode was not mistakes, but it was things that are overrated, maybe. Yeah, and I did have specificity there. It's not that you shouldn't do specific training, but I think that it's I do think it's overrated, especially for athletes doing longer distances, like in running, marathon running, or in triathlon, half and full distance triathlons. If you're doing sprint distance racing, then specificity, I think, has a bigger play potentially, because it's working on so well on your general physiology as well as the race specificity. Same thing with Olympic distance racing, which would be still a bit below threshold, but still fairly close. The issue I see is that, let's say you have somebody doing Ironman, and if they spend the last 4 or 5 months before an Ironman doing a lot of training at Ironman intensity, which is basically that zone 2 training for most athletes, it's just kind of fatiguing, but it's not providing such a big stimulus. Yes, the volume, if you're doing big volume, that provides a stimulus, but you could do the same volume doing zone 1 training, and you could add some more quality intensity sessions like threshold training, VO2 max training on top of that, and get more out of your training that way, and then add in the Ironman specific training in the last 8 weeks or so. I think would be enough. Yeah, you, not in terms of the volume, but in terms of the specific work on the specific intensities, for sure. You just don't need to do that much of that specific intensity, especially the slower the race pace is. What you want to do is, you definitely want to have the endurance, so you need to build up that volume. You need to build up your long rides, your long bikes, all of that, long swims for sure. But if you have a high VO2 max and a high threshold and a good economy, which you don't need to do race specificity for any of that. If anything, that's going to be just an opportunity cost to improve those factors more. Your race pace is always going to be a percentage of your threshold primarily, and the threshold is going to be a percentage of your VO2 max. So both of those are important. And so yeah, you could just get so much more out of your training by not doing as much specificity, if that is the type of training you're doing. But again, it doesn't mean to not do specificity, but it means to limit it. And one other, I guess, problem I see is when athletes race a lot. Maybe not so many athletes do this for Ironman, but definitely if we think about half distance triathlon, which is still for a lot of athletes, let's say zone 3 training and racing, better stimulus, but not as good a stimulus, I would say, as getting into zone 4 and zone 5. So you don't want to do that all the time. But if you're doing races every 2 months on that distance, then potentially you could get into a situation where you're constantly doing that kind of training and you're just limiting your ability to do the other type of training that would improve you more. So then you need to choose, well, which are your key races that you're going to train specifically for, and for which races are you going to maybe do the race, but your training is going to be more focused on other aspects of your physiology.
That's an interesting take on specificity. So less race pace, more distributed, closer to the race.
Yeah, but again, this would depend a bit on what your race distance is. If your race distance is Olympic distance triathlon, and you're at a level where you race an Olympic distance at not at threshold, but fairly close to threshold, then for sure the specific training is going to be a lot more useful for your general physiology. So you could do more specificity and it would be very useful. You would still want to do a bit of training that is even higher intensity, VO2 max, but you would need to do much less of that. So you can do more specificity because it would overlap with something that is already useful. If your goal distance is a 5K, where you're racing at faster than threshold, then you also want to be a bit careful with doing too much specificity, just because it's so intense that while it's a very useful intensity and very potent, you can also overdo it by doing it too much. So that's why you would want to be a bit careful when the intensity is a bit too high. But both Olympic and sprint distance, people think about sprint distance triathlon as being VO2 max, but nobody races a sprint distance triathlon in their zone 5. So I've never seen anybody do that. So
You would have a heart attack. But then how about swimming for like, let's say half or full distance? Because there specificity is swimming at that intensity for longer duration. Do you then also more recommend your athletes to do rather shorter sets, even though the race day they will have to swim 1.9 or 3.8 kilometers?
The principle still applies that to maximize your potential in triathlon or in any of the individual disciplines, you want to maximize the amount of work you're putting in that you can recover from, and within that, achieve good key sessions with quality intensity. And in swimming, you could add, you definitely need to work on your technique. You need to have quality technical development within that as well. And that's partially overlapping with just doing the training, or a lot of it is overlapping, but you also need maybe some more specific attention to the technique side. So coming back to your question, which let me think what your question was again.
If you then rather recommend also person for the swim part of the race to then again focus it still on doing some VO2 sessions closer to the race and not specifically race pace and longer distances, which is specific for the race demands.
Yeah. Well, I still think even for an Ironman, even though the swim is shorter, most people are not, let's exclude professional athletes from this, but age group athletes are still going to race it at a pretty moderate intensity, maybe in zone 3, and rather than zone 4, not really threshold, or even for most athletes, it's going to be lower than that still, zone 2. So there you still have I do want to do some specific sessions where you practice to do that for long sets, and for example, doing 400s at your race intensity and practicing pacing, holding that intensity. But again, 8 weeks is more than enough. Probably in swimming you would need even slightly less than that, but 8 weeks, if you want a blanket amount of time that could work well, then that's a good amount of time to do some specificity. But yes, you would definitely also want to do some other quality intensity. Maybe I would focus more on threshold rather than VO2 max in that period closer to the race, and do VO2 max a bit before that race specific block. You could have some VO2 max in there. I would not be against that at all, but maybe more the focus would be on threshold, because it's a good high intensity, but it's still more closer and more relevant to the race intensity. So it's a nice balance there of the two. but in terms of the distance, regardless of what your sets are, your main sets and the intensity focus, I would probably want to build up the swim and be able to do good long sets even before you get to the race specificity. So you would probably be doing 4 kilometer swims ideally before those 4 kilometer swims become race specific. Before that, it might be a longer warm up and then a long threshold set, and and maybe some endurance after, some strength work, and then as you get closer to the race, that turns into a race specific set, but you have already built up to doing that distance.
So we're coming closer to the end, and we have only 2 questions left for you. The first one is, which current trends do you see in tech or in training that you find useful, and which ones do you think are mostly just noise?
Interesting question. Gosh, I would need to have. Can you give me some suggestions of what trends you think exist in the ether?
Well, we talked about high carb intake. That's one.
I think also maybe in terms of gadgets, right? There's those things now that you can put on your hand while to swim, to get feedback on the pressure you apply in the water. Do you think such things are valuable? Of course, it depends on the level you are, right? Maybe as a beginner, that's not the best way to invest your money. But then also on the bike, because I'm still riding a manual non-electric bike, and I don't have any fancy adjustments to my bike. It's a quite standard TT bike. So when to upgrade, to add some, what is noise in terms of equipment, aero testing, all of those things.
On the recovery side, like how useful and how should you care about the recovery boots? My true family bought once, and I got very mad at her.
I sent them back.
Then no, what else came to mind? Carbon shoes. I mean, I guess it's an old trend, but yeah, some ideas.
No, carbon shoes is quite the standard. But then I guess also carbon shoes at which stage, right? Because you do see a marathon, people at the 4-hour race, which use carbon shoes. And the question is, well, when do you get benefits from using carbon shoes? At what pace does it make sense? And at what pace is it a waste of money?
There's still some research that indicate that at least for slower runners at marathon pace, they have benefit, but it should be said that they haven't tested that in a full marathon. So you never know if there are other effects. For example, you get too tired, like because they're less stable perhaps, and you end up losing the gain that you get in the economy in the earlier stages of the marathon. I am definitely not picking carbon shoes though. That's not, I think that in general, that's a very good positive tech trend, like or positive, I don't know, because it's expensive, but it's a trend where it works for performance. I think that kind of alluded to it earlier, but some of the recovery data and wearables, and I'm not going to like discuss HRV again, but even like things like sleep tracking, I think that even if it's accurate, which many of the trackers are not at all accurate, but even if it is accurate, I fail to see the usefulness of that data, honestly. Like, it's pretty easy to know when you went to bed and estimate how long it took you to fall asleep and feel the quality of your sleep. And that's going to be much more valuable. The quality especially, it's going to be so much more valuable to just reflect on how well did you feel that you slept compared to what percentage of your sleep was REM versus non-REM, and how many sleep cycles did you go through, even if it was completely accurate. So that's definitely a space that I see as, overhyped and not very useful. Did you also ask for useful, like a good, good trends? Yeah, I do. By the way, I do want to say about bikes. While the bike technology, it's improved so much. When you have all of the things that you see on the pros bikes now, it's so fast. Maybe the electronic shifting itself, it's not making your bike faster, but definitely the having everything integrated is making the bike faster. And but I do think it's a bit of a, yeah, I don't know. I don't like the fact that you need to buy an expensive bike and you need a custom cockpit and you need all of these other things. It's annoying. And to be fair, I think that you can get away on getting a good bike and getting a really good bike fit. You don't need to upgrade too many things to get pretty close to the maximum that you could with a fully optimized bike. So I think that maybe that's a little bit overrated, the bike optimization for amateur athletes, not for pro athletes. Like that's necessary if you want to win, but for amateur athletes I think that it's like just it's less than the cherry on top, compared to just getting stronger on the bike. um but yeah, a positive trend, I mean, I do think shoe technology, honestly, it's not just carbon but the foams, how much better you recover with some of these new phones. I think it's, yeah, I think that that's something that is really nice, with them. So yeah, and especially now I have only been running, not doing triathlon for the last year and a bit, year and a few months. So it's additionally fun for me now to benefit from the shoe technology because it's yeah, it's what I do now mainly as a sport.
Good choice.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite shoe?
Yes, I want to say it's the Asics Metaspeed Sky, and I'm actually on one of the older models, so I'm looking to upgrade to one of the newer Metaspeed, and I might go for the Edge because that should, in theory, based on what they say about the shoes, it should work better for my running style. But I have really enjoyed the Asics Metaspeed Sky. I also have, but I really liked the Nike Vaporfly, the original one when it came out. That I think is a similar feel to the Asics Metaspeed Sky, which the one that I have is the original Asics Metaspeed Sky as well. And going back way further to before carbon technology, I really like the Mizuno Wave Hitogami as a pretty kind of light, fast shoe. I used to love that. There was also a New Balance shoe, RC 1000 something, that I liked a lot. But again, that was old school racing flat. But yeah, I guess, yeah, current day Asics Metaspeed Sky, but I need to get up to date with the newer models there.
Nice, cool. Yeah, I always run in the same shoes, same carbon shoes on, but I'm kind of thinking of, maybe it's time to try something
Time to have a Vaporfly.
different.
We all know.
To see if I can get faster.
I haven't enjoyed the newer Vaporfly so much, and I really enjoyed the first Alpha Fly, but the second and third, I don't know. Even though the third one, when I tested it, it was basically as fast as the first one. Although the first one at that point had 200, 300 kilometers on it, but it was still fast. So yeah, I don't know. I didn't feel quite right, and it's not a shoe that I would use on a course with anything more than a handful of turns, because it's just so unstable. Yeah, and that's what I liked about the Asics Metaspeed Skies, that they feel very stable for a carbon plated shoe. I think they feel very stable in general, but they are very fast. They just don't feel like that. They don't feel like you're running on a lot of foam. They feel more like that old school racing flat, but with the benefits of modern technology.
Good to know.
Good to know, yeah. And
I'm not sponsored, by the way.
maybe
after this episode.
maybe after this episode. But yeah, we're approaching the end, and we always close by asking our guests for advice for the listeners. And since this was an episode more on getting marginal gains and improving as an already competitive age grouper, I want to ask you if you have some advice for people, competitive age grouper, trying to, podium or get their Kona slot, on how to achieve that. Work with you.
Asking with a friend. Asking for a friend.
For those like very competitive age groupers, coming back to what I said before, don't be afraid of working hard. But again, understanding hard here in the context of the amount of work, not just the intensity of the work, but of course both being part of that, volume and intensity. But you can't replace one with the other. And that's the other thing, coming back to another thing that I said before, which is for everybody, not just for competitive age groupers, but it's kind of even though you said about marginal gains, and there are definitely a lot of details and things, but try to assess your training and see if it has become overly complicated, because that's easily happened. And then it's hard to do the hard work almost, because you're overthinking things, you're doing too much paralysis by analysis, and too much time goes into, you need to put time into planning if you're self-coached, which is one of the reasons to get a coach, because at least for me, I know when I'm self-coached, I don't put the time into planning, and my results as a self-coached athlete are also not as consistent as they are when I'm coached. But so you need to put time into planning, but you don't need to overthink things. You don't need to overcomplicate things, and you definitely don't want to change things every few weeks when you hear a new interesting podcast or see a new video. Kind of be more consistent, simplify things, find your few key sessions, and remember that thing about do good quality hard work within maximizing the amount of like overall aerobic volume, and that will take you like a long way. And I think that most people, even if they're already competitive, can still go much further with just those couple of things.
Great advice, and also something we haven't heard before, so thanks for that. And where can listeners find you if they want to reach out to you or be coached by you?
Scientifictriathlon.com is the website, and you can listen to the podcast That Triathlon Show wherever you get your podcast. Also now on YouTube, relatively recently starting putting it out as a video podcast. So if that's your preferred platform, then we're there as well. But yeah, scientifictriathlon.com, That Triathlon Show. Those are the two main outlets.
Cool. Thanks so much for coming on. Really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate your time.
Me too. Thank you, and good luck with everything you're doing with Algo. It's a super interesting product and project. So I hope everything goes really well, and it continues to develop as it has been until now.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Human Endurance. We hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you like the show, don't forget to rate it and hit the subscribe button whatever you're listening to it. This helps us to reach a bigger audience. Thank you, and see you next time.